Coming in at number 10, we have the Spartans, enslaved people. Every movie about ancient Greece will paint the Spartans as these noble, unbeatable men who led armies that could crush anyone, even if they were outnumbered 1,000 to 1. But when you go back in time, you will find that the morals of any human were pretty scarce, especially when you're comparing them to today's standards. The Spartans were known to conquer and enslave the people they defeated in war. The group who might have gotten this the worst was the Helots, another group of Greeks that had a much smaller civilization than the Spartans, and they didn't really stand a chance when it came to fighting. The Spartans would attack them annually to take people to work in their fields and also make sure their forces would never reach the point where they were strong enough to defeat the Spartans. This worked in twofold, keeping the enemy down and keeping your fields full of free labor. One of the worst aspects of this was when the Spartans would utilize the Cryptia. Think of them as the most elite force in Sparta that would be sent out into cities to lay down Spartan law, like the Justice League, but they're all evil. This group would round up the strongest and least submissive Helots and chop their heads off. This way the Helots would never grow a strong enough army to fight back against the Spartans, and they wouldn't have anyone who is whispering words of rebellion against them. And guys, make sure you hit that like button because it really helps us out. Next on the list, guys, we have starting them young. One thing the movies didn't lie about was that the Spartan culture didn't waste any time in exposing boys to blood, warfare, and brutality. As soon as a boy turned 7, it was time for him to join the ranks of the army and be trained to be a killing machine. They would be taken from their home and brought to a training facility that did one thing and one thing only: make people Spartans. Everything they read, everything they held, everything they experienced was to make them better at warfare. This was how they were able to make some of the best warriors of all time. One of the most famous aspects of this was how troops were fed. Everyone would be given just enough food. This would make sure that you didn't eat so much that you were plump and tired, but not so little that you were hungry, but also so you weren't starving but you still wanted more. It was this perfect balance, almost like you needed to fight to prove yourself in order to get your next meal. It's a very clever tactic to make sure that your warriors are not only sharp but determined to fight. Coming in at number 8, we have tough love. You know that scene in 300 when they're holding the baby and checking to see if it has any impurities, checking to see if it's indeed worthy, and if not, they're going to get rid of it for lack of a better term? Well, that was how they actually did things. Now, it wasn't as dramatic as the movie. There was no lightning and mountain that was fit to be Olympus. What they would actually do was leave the baby out in the wilderness, and it's thought that some of these babies were actually rescued by travelers. But the tough love didn't stop there. If you were chosen to be one of the strong, then you would have to be tested to be a tough as nails baby. Even as a baby, you never got shot, man. If you cried, no one would respond to you and you would be constantly left alone. Before you even had memories, your body would be conditioned to deal with pain and solitude. And if you think that this was a brutal practice of its time, well, it was, but it was something that all of the surrounding regions loved. It's said that Spartan nannies were the greatest in all of Greece because they knew how to raise a strong child. Coming in at number 7, we have closed the borders. Spartans had a massive superiority complex when it came to the rest of Greece. They were convinced that they were the best in the whole country and possibly the world, and in some aspects they were. They were skilled in warfare, far beyond any of their neighbors, but just because you can win a fight doesn't mean you have all the other aspects figured out. But because of this hubris, they shut down trade to all of their neighboring regions. There are sections of Sparta that are surrounded by mountains, which made it easy for them to control the trade routes coming in and out of their country. Eventually, the surrounding leadership was like, fine dude, we won't do any business with you if you're gonna be like that. We're not gonna fight you on this. Sparta thought that having no foreign influence would have strengthened their people. They would no longer be hindered by the weaker foreign ideals. Well, they were dead wrong. All the areas that Spartan wasn't the strongest in, like bronze work, scripture, sculpting, and many of the other elements of a strong, prosperous city, were lost and they fell behind big time. Bronze work being the most crucial because it related directly to warfare. Coming in number 6, we have reduced their culture to a tourist attraction. The once mighty people were eventually not what they used to be, and people were no longer afraid of them. People would travel far and wide to come to Sparta to see the wonders of what was one of the greatest nations in the world. Now, they were on top for over 300 years, but after after the Romans came in and shut them down, it was time for things to change. These tales of Sparta from the past would give people the inspiration to come and see the wondrous land and what it was like. And the new Spartans living there now made money not off of warfare, but off of selling the old tales of their ancestors. I mean, it's not as brutal as some of the other things on this list, but it's sad to see a once great warrior nation reduced to a museum. Coming in number 5, we have You Had to Be Hot. Spartans had very strict rules on how you're supposed to look, especially for the men. Here's a very strange tradition that the Spartans had that would give anyone body dysmorphia and an eating disorder. Every 10 days, the Spartan men would walk out of their house naked. They would stand there perfectly tall and wait for someone to come through and give their body a rundown. This person would look at every inch of them to see how their muscle tone was, to see if their body fat was up to par. Now, if it wasn't, they would be beaten and shamed by their peers. It was actually seen as a public offense. You're a Spartan and you need to be in shape to protect your homeland, so if you weren't, it wasn't just letting yourself go, but you were making the whole country weaker and easier to invade. So the public pressure to always be in shape was massive. Not to mention the beating would have been pretty severe. You wouldn't want to have to get a major whooping every 10 days from a group of men who are some of the best warriors in the world. Alright guys, coming in next at number 4, we have hazing. It's not just frat boys and sorority girls who like to haze, it was the entire Spartan race. Now, mind you, the hazing that goes on in American colleges isn't to build up some of the strongest warriors in the world. Most of the guys who come out of there have soft bodies who can barely swing a golf club, but for the Spartans, this was how they would weed out weakness. If the elders saw that one of the younger men in training was afraid of something or avoided something, they would point it out to the group and encourage the others to ridicule them for it. And if things got really out of hand, they would encourage fighting. Could you imagine being at school or college and then two people break out in a fist fight and one of the professors walks out and starts cheering fight with everyone else? That sounds like a bad comedy from the 90s, but for Spartans, that was real life. Treatment like this ensured that there was pressure from peers to be the strongest possible. Coming in at number 3, we have public shaming. So it should be no surprise that Spartans had more than one way to shame you if you didn't follow the laws. A big thing they didn't like was cowardice. I mean, I think you could have figured that one out. And if you were caught being a coward, they would make sure that everyone in Sparta knew what was wrong with you. They would make you wear certain clothes that were marked with the sign of a coward, and they would make you shave half your beard. I think this was more for the humiliation factor. Walking around with half a beard would make you look so stupid. Also, it would be super hard to miss. I've never seen someone with half their facial hair and thought, you know, if I wasn't paying attention, I would have totally missed that. No, it's something that sticks out a lot, and it makes sense why they would punish you in this way for cowardice. They were a warrior society, so they needed everyone to be strong or their society would crumble because the backbone of it was fighting, and social stigma was probably the biggest way you can get people to comply with the laws. Coming in number 2, we have lifelong allegiance to the army. Could you imagine if when you were born the government already had a job for you and you had to be involved in it from the time you were 7 all the way up until you were 60, unless you died or were seriously injured and could no longer use your body properly? Well, that was the life of every Spartan man. By law, every dude had to join the army. Now, this wasn't for every single person in Sparta. This was only for the Spartan citizens. So even though it would have been nice to be born into such a high respected class of people, your life would have been stripped away from you and all you would know is war and battle. Now, there was a lower class living in Sparta that was usually doing crafting and architecture. They were not respected enough to be considered Spartans and accepted into the army. And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have dying in battle. The only way you could be remembered after you passed was if you died in battle, and that was for men. For women, it was if you died in childbirth. There were strict laws in Spartan society that said if you died in any other way, that you would be buried in an unmarked grave or not even buried at all. So that meant that you either join the army or become nothing. Public shaming for missing battles or becoming too old to die in battle would often result in people taking their own life. Yeah, you didn't want to be the old fart at a party in Spartan society because no one would respect you.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have how they faced death. Gladiators had to attend schools, which were called ludus, where they learned the rules and prepared for their fate in the arena. One of the main things that they are taught in these schools was how to face death. Honestly, this is not a college course I personally would have signed up for, but unfortunately these people didn't really get a say in their electives. They would have to practice the correct eye contact and posture, which, when they ended up in battle, could sometimes be the difference for them being shown mercy and death. This is because when a gladiator was down and about to be killed in a battle, his opponent would wait and look to the presenter of the games. This is because the presenter would then be the deciding factor on whether the fallen gladiator lived that day. During this pause for decision, the presenter and the crowd would look at the fallen soldier to see if he looked frightened or in pain. If he showed any signs of anything other than pure bravery, there was no way that his life was being spared that day. A fallen gladiator was meant to maintain eye contact as well as even hold out his neck as if he was welcoming the sword. I couldn't imagine having to do this because, you know, I would be absolutely terrified like any regular human being would be. But the bravery was sometimes rewarded, and this was the way to have your life spared. Unfortunately, however, being spared didn't mean never having to fight again. You would still be put back into battle once your wounds were healed. In our number 9 spot today we have no escape. Since most battles would only leave one gladiator standing, of course some people would have the idea to fake their own deaths in the hopes of being able to somehow escape in the end. While this is a smart idea, it wasn't necessarily an uncommon one, but of course a tradition was put in place in order to stop that from happening. After a gladiator faced his death, he would then be carried into a special room. In this room they would remove all of the armor he was wearing, and then they would cut his throat, which is just a fact I wish that I could unlearn. Of course, this was to ensure that he definitely was no longer alive. What's even worse, however, is that this was only the practice for those who were considered to have died honorable deaths. For those who weren't considered to have died honorably, a slave would come out into the arena and hit their head with a large rock or club. This is obviously incredibly gruesome and disturbing. I suppose this is all to say that if you weren't shown mercy before your death, there is absolutely no way that you would be escaping it. In our number 8 spot today we have the Noxii. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit that thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. In the times of gladiators, there were people who would be put into the arena called Noxii. These people weren't regular gladiators and were never well respected because they were actually criminals. They would be put into the arena because they were considered expendable fighters, which is obviously quite dark. Once in the arena, they would have to exclaim, "We who are about to die salute the emperor," and then the battle would begin. Sometimes a bunch of Noxii would have to fight each other, but other times they were just more like props. They would even go into the arena with no armor, or even sometimes pretend armor, where the opposing gladiator would then make a spectacle out of them for the crowds. This is obviously a very gruesome and unfair form of execution that I am just very glad has not continued on. In our number 7 spot today we have the Naumachia. The biggest gladiator spectacle is believed to have been created by Julius Caesar, and they were called Naumachia, which means naval combat. These battles were held by the Field of Mars in Rome on specially dug lakes, which when filled with water could hold a bunch of very large ships. These ships would hold around 2,000 prisoners who would be dressed as Roman enemies, and they would all have to fight amongst themselves, of course to the death. These insanely large spectacles of course needed a lot of people who would then be losing their lives. Because of the demand for people, prisons would usually have to completely empty all of their prisoners in order to make up enough people in these battles. That is just absolutely insane to me. These battles would apparently draw the largest crowds, some even exceeding 500,000 people apparently. In our number 6 spot today we have the Emperor Dress Up. It wasn't an uncommon practice to see emperors play a little dress up game that was honestly pretty messed up. They would dress up like gladiators and step into the arena prepared for battle. This doesn't seem dark yet, but here's the catch. Their opponent would always be somebody who is at a disadvantage, obviously in order to ensure that the emperor was on a path to an extremely easy win. Some of the opponents would be someone who was missing a limb, or someone with a blunt weapon that couldn't do much damage. Sometimes they would even fight some kind of exotic animal, but of course made it easy for them to win again. One emperor who was known for doing this fairly often was Commodus, and he would dress up like Hercules since he was incredibly pompous and saw himself like a god. Clearly not so godly since he had to ensure his opponent was at a disadvantage in order to be able to win, but at least this is something we don't have to worry about anymore, and we can just remember him as a total jerk. In our number 5 spot today we have animals. Sometimes in an attempt to spice up the regular old boring fight to the death, gladiators would be put into the arena with an animal instead of another human being. As animals were very expensive, they weren't used every day, but the organizers of the battle would go all out for the fights that did include them. Sometimes the animals would be used to kill people who were considered undesirables, such as Christians at the time, which is just so crazy to hear. Most animals who were used in these spectacles unfortunately didn't make it out alive. That, combined with the fact that people loved when animals were included, led to a huge trade in exotic animals, which then drove some species really close to extinction and even caused hippos to disappear from the Nile. In our number 4 spot today we have taking things into their own hands. Many gladiators were unfortunately forced into this life. After all, I'm not really sure how many people would have been yearning for a chance to fight to the death just for entertainment of the crowds. Definitely not a line of work I would consider if it was an option. Since these people were being forced into these battles and they knew they most likely wouldn't see the other side, they chose to take a little bit of control and pass away on their own terms. Many prisoners chose to end their own lives before even seeing the inside of the arena. To make this already terrible situation just a little worse, taking your own life wasn't necessarily exceptionally easy in those days, so there are some pretty horrific accounts of how people went about this, which are honestly too dark for me to even discuss right now. One example I will talk about today though was more of a spectacle and kind of a movement. A 4th century politician put on an event one day where he gathered 20 gladiators and put them in an arena. They obviously fought until only one was left standing, and he ended up taking his own life in the end. This was something they hadn't seen before, so it obviously left everyone very confused. In our number 3 spot today we have gladiator blood. In a battle when a gladiator was struck down and was bleeding a lot, it was not uncommon to see a man running towards his body. This is unfortunately because the man wanted to drink the gladiator's blood like some kind of a vampire. This is pretty disgusting in my opinion, but if a man was seen doing this, it's because he was an epileptic, and at the time it was believed that the only cure was to drink blood directly from a gladiator's wound. How annoying would it be to go through all of that just to find out that that absolutely does not cure epilepsy? If a gladiator instead had a wound that was causing his insides to be outsides, his liver would be harvested and then sold as a cure for epilepsy. You would be instructed to eat it in 9 separate doses in order to heal yourself. I'm not going to lie, I'm not sure which one of these options is worse because both are absolutely disgusting. I also think it's worth mentioning that gladiators' blood was also sold for regular men to drink because gladiators were idolized and they believed that drinking their blood would increase their desires, for a lack of a better way to put it. Apparently this blood was really expensive, but I wonder how much of it was actually from gladiators. In our number 2 spot today we have gladiator burials. After a gladiator passed away, it was extremely common for them to be cremated. Their families would then be given rites where they would usually bury the ashes along with different offerings that they chose. Some places even had cemeteries that were specifically set aside for gladiators to be buried in. These traditions, however, were only in place for those who were considered to have died honorably. For those who had dishonorable deaths, they certainly were not treated well. If their bodies didn't get claimed by anyone, they would just toss their bodies into a river or even just some sort of wasteland. Even today this would obviously be considered a pretty horrible act, but it was even worse back then because of the fact that Romans believed that the soul could not rest until dirt covered the remains. In our number 1 spot today we have asking for mercy. After a gladiator died in battle, they would be carried out of the arena in a way that kind of honored their sacrifice and kept their dignity intact. But this was only the tradition tradition for those who were considered to have died honorably, like we've talked about so many times already today. If a gladiator showed any kind of fear or hesitation, he was considered weak, and weakness was incredibly frowned upon in these times. I feel like being afraid of being killed isn't necessarily a weakness, especially for those who were forced into this position in the first place, but hey, I guess it's probably a good thing that things have changed since the days of 200 BC. If a gladiator asked for mercy and was denied it, this is another way in which he would have been considered weak and to not have died honorably. These people would then just have their bodies dragged from the arena rather than being carried. They thought that there was no reason to go through the hassle of carrying him when he already made such a fool of himself. I truly am very, very, very glad that I live at this time in the world rather than those times, because everything on this list made it sound really, really terrible.
Starting off this countdown, we have the discipline. So the poor Roman warriors were disciplined through fear. If they were a coward in battle or were slacking while on duty, they would be stoned. Some would survive, others wouldn't. Even if they committed minor offenses, they would receive severe punishment. So basically, they were living in fear. They would always have to act strong and courageous, or else they would be severely injured. In fact, whips were often common at Roman military camps. Another cruel punishment would be slowly breaking the soldiers' ribs one by one. That is incredibly cruel and painful. They lost a lot of their warriors from these punishments. In our ninth spot, we have the mouthwash. And if you guys are liking this video so far, make sure to give it a big thumbs up. Also, if you want to see a Q&A, then make sure to go check out Most Amazing Elite, because right after this video, I'm doing a little Q&A answering your burning questions. So back in ancient Rome, urine was considered valuable. Sounds crazy and disgusting, I know. But they had people whose job was to go around collecting pee from public urinals, or they would go door to door asking people to do their business in a vat. Why? Well, they use this fluid for a lot of stuff. They would clean their clothes in it, and it's also how they clean their teeth. I know. They used to use pee as mouthwash. I want to just gag thinking about it. But according to them, they thought it was a way to keep their teeth pearly and clean. Can you imagine? No. And like other people's pee? No. Anyway, sorry. Moving on to number 8, we have the communal sponge. If you thought that point was bad, wait till you hear this one. So the public toilets in ancient Rome were absolutely disgusting. Sure, they had a pretty advanced sewer system for their time, but believe me, it wasn't pretty. In fact, it was said that it was hardly ever cleaned, if even at all. These toilets were shared with dozens of other people, but you were given one sponge on a stick. That sponge was used to wipe your behind. The sponge was never cleaned. So everyone was just sharing that dirty sponge wiper. I told you this point was gonna be bad. I just feel dirty talking about it. I need to go home and take a shower or something. Like other people on your bum. It's disgusting. In our 7th spot, we have the warrior blood. So apparently when a Roman gladiator or warrior lost their life, their blood was collected and then sold as medicine. The Romans believed that the warrior's blood had magical powers to it, and that it could cure epilepsy or diseases. That wasn't all though. They also would take out the warrior's liver and eat them raw. Again, for similar reasons. What's crazy is that it might have actually worked. Some Roman physicians reported that people that drank blood would actually be cured from their seizures. Even if that's the case, we aren't vampires, okay? Like, I'm not too keen on blood drinking. Moving on to number 6, we have the dead skin cells. I honestly don't know what the Romans were thinking. But basically, back then, soap was a rare commodity. So warriors and athletes would clean themselves by covering themselves in oil and then scraping the dead skin cells off their body with this special tool. Okay, I get it, like they like to exfoliate, and that's creative, I guess. But then they would save their sweat and skin scrapings and put it into a bottle. Then this was sold to women, and it was considered an aphrodisiac. Ew, just ew. But wait, it gets worse. The woman would then take this skin and sweat and rub it all over their face. like a face cream. They thought it would make them irresistible to men. Like, ew, imagine if that was still a thing nowadays. Any woman that did that would be considered a psychopath or something. We're now in our 5th and halfway mark with the cowards. Back then, warriors were super strict. They had no tolerance for cowards at all. In fact, they had very cruel punishments for people that would chicken out during battle. If you were deemed a coward, basically you were ridiculed, and then it would be hard to find a woman to marry. One of their punishments would be to go around wearing cloaks with patches of dyed cloth, looking untidy with only half of your beard shaved. Half. It was weird. This was considered a cruel and embarrassing punishment. But believe me, it's way better than some of the other punishments that they would go through. More on this shortly. Moving on to number 4, we have death first. Roman warriors did not take loss for an answer. It was either they win or they die trying. Literally. To them, if they were ever in a position where they had to surrender or were defeated, they were expected to take their own lives. To them, they rather die than surrender or lose, which was considered a huge disgrace. In our 3rd spot, we have the GOAT energy drink. Nowadays, if people want a huge pick-me-up, they turn to Red Bull or Monsters. Well, back then, obviously they didn't have access to those drinks, but they did have access to a different kind of energy drink, one made from goat. So warriors that needed an energy boost would eat goat dung. Apparently, it gave them a good little pick-me-up. Actually, rumor has it that Emperor Nero loved to drink it. But that wasn't the only thing the dung was used for. They would use it as a makeshift band-aid to patch up their wounds. During the spring, they collected a bunch of it and then would dry it out. And ta-da! A band-aid. In emergencies though, they would just plop on fresh piss. In our 2nd spot, we have decimation. One of the most brutal punishments the Roman warriors went through was something called decimation. Basically, a bunch of guilty men would be divided into groups of 10. From there, they would draw straws. The one who drew the shortest straw would be killed by the other 9 men. So basically, it was all left to chance. You better be extremely lucky, or else. They did this because they couldn't afford to kill off a bunch of warriors, so instead they just killed one off brutally to scare the other men. Now, decimation was around until the reign of Emperor Diocletian, which was 284 to 305 AD. And in our number 1 spot, we have punishment of the sack. This was another brutal form of punishment. Basically, the wrongdoer would have their head covered by a sack made from wolf skin. Their feet would then be covered in wooden shoes. From there, they would be beaten with rods. Not only that, but for the most part, the wrongdoer would be placed in the sack with other animals in it, like snakes or monkeys, and then it was sewn shut. Then the sack was dragged into the sea or river. So not only would they suffer from drowning, but they would be bit and scratched while on the way down. But this punishment was only saved for people that did the worst of the worst crimes, especially parricide, the killing of a parent or near relative. That was considered a sign of extreme ungratefulness and disrespect, something the Romans took very seriously.